As someone with a moderate degree of financial literacy, I've been shocked to discover that asset prices have continued marching higher despite the rising interest rates. And now in an environment where home prices, for instance, are criminally high because of the combination of high asset prices and high interest rates, I've set out to determine how interest rates will affect asset prices and the economy moving forward. And my discoveries have been more unsettling than I could possibly have imagined. So strap in, because this one is definitely an eye-opener. But as always, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I really do appreciate your support of my channel. And also check down below in the description for access to my Discord, financial calculator, and all the other things that I have to offer on this channel. And with that said, let's jump in. Living in this economy is painful from multiple perspectives. For one thing, our nation's leaders seem to have no issue pumping the economy full of unproductive debt, running massive twin deficits, burning taxpayer dollars on unsanctioned proxy wars for the last 2 decades, and fueling asset price inflation, which the average young person simply can't keep up with. But despite all this insanity, I personally have held out a lot of hope for our current Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, because of his willingness to raise interest rates in the face of massive political opposition from the various factions in the US and in Europe. But the question is, will raising interest rates actually solve consumer price inflation and asset price inflation? Or are they the wrong tool at the wrong time, which is being deployed by a well-intentioned soul in Jay Powell? Luckily, in my research, I found an article by Lynn Alden, which is excellent as usual, that answers this question directly. And I'll leave a link down below for y'all to access that article, but let me summarize some of the key findings from it and also share with you some other insights that I have. So first, let's separate our initial question into 2 separate questions. Question 1, will rising interest rates lower asset prices? And number 2, will rising interest rates lower consumer price inflation? As you might have gathered, these are 2 very different things. For example, the US stock market returned a total of 9.97% per year on average since 2008, while the median house price increased from around $260,000 to $550,000 in roughly the same time period, an average annual rate of about 8.5%. Meanwhile, inflation increased an average of only about 2.4% over the same period, according to the CPI. So clearly, the rate of inflation is not the same thing as the rate of asset price inflation. Therefore, I'd like to point out that the opposite could also occur. That is that we have high consumer price inflation and low asset price inflation. This type of environment, in other words, would be stagflationary. Now, with that out of the way, we next need to understand where inflation comes from. On the money side, obviously, inflation comes from the growth in money supply. Very generally speaking, this growth in money supply comes either from the private sector through bank lending or from the public sector through deficit spending. For example, according to Lynn Alden's article, periods of fast bank lending or large monetized fiscal deficits and thus rapid money supply growth tend to create inflationary environments, while periods of fiscal austerity and or private sector deleveraging events and thus slow money supply growth or outright money supply contraction tend to create disinflationary or outright deflationary environments. Next, on the economy side, inflation comes from either an increase or decrease in economic productivity through technological developments, energy and resource extraction efficiencies, lower or higher cost infrastructure, quality and supply of labor, and a lot more. Again, Lynn Alden explains this by saying periods of technological stagnation, societal dysfunction, the need for resiliency over efficiency, war, and scarce natural resources tend to all contribute to an experience of inflation due to their negative effect on the supply of goods and services. On the other hand, periods of technological improvement, labor specialization, the sacrifice of resiliency for efficiency, geopolitical and civic peace, and abundant natural resources tend to all contribute to the experience of disinflation due to their positive effect on the supply of goods and services. So with this basic understanding of inflationary versus deflationary environments, the next question becomes what characterizes our current period in history and how does it compare to other similar periods in the past? To answer this question, let's review the inflationary characteristics of the 1940s and the 1970s like Lynn does in her article. Rewinding the clock for the 1940s, this period basically saw inflation due directly to excess fiscal deficit spending due to World War II. During this period, the US reached a debt to GDP ratio of about 121%, which at the time was the highest on record, but now is only seconded to the debt to GDP ratio we got in 2020 at around 134%. And even today, our debt to GDP ratio is about 120%, which is roughly equivalent to the peak of the World War II era. However, unlike the post-World War II economy, it's very unclear how our economy is going to get out of this mess. Basically, in the 1940s and 50s, after the war ended, fiscal deficit spending was able to slow dramatically, which also led to a slowdown in the rate of money supply growth. Simultaneously, the remaining fiscal and private sector spending was able to be redirected into economically productive activities, such as retooling the US's manufacturing base for a post-war period. In other words, and as Lynn Alden put it, the aggregate price inflation was able to be quelled because of the slowdown in money supply relative to the growth in goods and services. Now that we understand that the inflation problem of the 1940s was caused by fiscal deficit spending, we should also appreciate that rising rates in this environment would have actually not helped the situation as far as inflation goes. And this is, of course, because the inflation in the 1940s was not caused by interest rate sensitive factors such as bank lending. However, the situation in the 1970s was completely opposite. Unlike the 1940s, the asset price inflation of the 70s was actually more caused by bank lending and consumer demand from the baby boomer generation. The inflation problem, therefore, was pretty simple to solve. It was simply a matter of slowing bank lending by raising interest rates. And so how did this go, you may ask? Well, during Arthur Burns' term as Fed chair from 1970 to 1978, the inflation rate averaged nearly 7% and even reached nearly 12.5%. And although Chair Burns raised interest rates quite high between 1973 and 1974, his failure to keep them there after 1974 allowed bank lending-driven inflation problems to return with a vengeance for the rest of the decade and even into the 1980s. So why did this happen? Basically, as nominal interest rates fall relative to the rate of inflation, the incentive to go out and borrow money from a bank increases dramatically because you can use that money to buy hard assets, which will theoretically hold their value with inflation. And of course, for foreigners who hold US debt, the incentive to continue to do so is low if the rate of inflation is higher than the rate of interest that they accrue on the debt. Therefore, they will sell their bonds and treasuries in order to get dollars and then sell the dollars into the open market, thereby weakening the dollar. And if you didn't understand that, the basic gist is that as demand for dollar-denominated bonds and other assets falls, the dollar tends to weaken, which creates higher import prices and therefore more inflation. So of course, as Paul Volcker famously did in the 1980s, the solution was to raise interest rates, which would strengthen the dollar, lower import prices, lower the amount of bank lending, and therefore quell inflation, which is exactly what happened. Now in the 2020s, what's the difference? Well, as Lynn Alden put it, we're essentially facing a nightmare inflation scenario for central bankers because of the following reasons. Number one, we have a very high sovereign debt to GDP ratio. Number two, we have very large and structural fiscal deficits, which are tied to an aging demographic. Number three, we have very high and unproductive military spending with no obvious resolutions in sight. Number four, we have very significant supply constraints such as tight oil markets and labor markets. And number five, we have a weak real economy, which is also heavily dependent on high asset prices to supply the federal government with tax revenue. So let's break this down. So like the 1940s, we have extremely high debt to GDP, but unlike the 1940s where the fiscal spending spigots could basically turn off, this time it's more structural because we have an aging demographic, military spending, and forever wars, and I would say relatively weak political will. So with these fixed structural deficits, it's going to be much more challenging in this environment to fix inflation by bringing down the debt to GDP ratio through austerity measures and increased economic productivity, which honestly is what's really needed in this scenario. But there's also some similarities with the 1970s, which I'd like to point out quickly as well. Like the 1970s, the amount and the rate of asset price inflation over the past couple decades has been pretty astonishing. However, unlike the 1970s, bank lending has slowed dramatically, but the problem is that the existing debt pool is so large and it's also been financed at such low interest rates. Also, like the 70s, we're facing significant supply constraints like they did during the OPEC oil embargo in the early 70s. However, this time around, the supply constraints are coming from all directions, including the labor market. And since supply and labor constraints are so multifaceted, it really exacerbates the inflation problem. Plus, the commodity constraints in particular are less tied, I would say, to geopolitical circumstances like they were during the OPEC oil embargo of the 70s, and more tied to actual facts in the ground, meaning there's just less stuff to mine. And also, unlike the 70s, they had a key advantage over our current situation, which was the fact that they had a sovereign debt to GDP ratio in the 30s-ish. This basically meant that the central bank could raise interest rates dramatically without blowing out the deficit. Today, however, the situation is of course much more complicated. Like the 1940s, the debt to GDP ratio is really, really high, meaning that if we continue to raise interest rates, we're going to balloon the interest payment on the deficit, which, as you can see from this graph, is already occurring. However, if the central bank lowers interest rates in this environment, they could potentially lower them below the rate of inflation, which would cause an explosion in bank lending and therefore more inflation coming from the private sector as well as the public sector. Plus, lowering interest rates would probably just give the Keynesians in Washington more of an excuse to spend insane amounts of money. So we would be getting it from both sides if we decided to lower interest rates. And in fact, this is exactly the scenario I saw when working in Argentina after college. In a country with high foreign debt, structural deficits, and low real interest rates, inflation was completely out of control. People would buy anything, even dishwashers that they didn't need, just to have something besides the currency, which was ever falling in value. And this will shock you, but it's true. In my 3 months living in Argentina, the price of bus tickets doubled. Imagine trying to run an economy in that kind of environment. It would be completely impossible. And of course, I'm not suggesting that the US is going to turn into Argentina, because I think we have several key economic advantages, including the fact that we can print our own currency. But I am saying that it doesn't look very good that we have so many similarities. But regardless, the point of this whole spiel is that raising or lowering interest rates in this current environment is not the solution to the inflation problem, because raising interest rates will only blow out the fiscal deficit, whereas lowering interest rates will probably blow out the fiscal deficit and blow out private sector bank lending. So as Lynn Alden put it in her article, raising interest rates in a high public debt environment is like giving someone Tylenol when they have a gunshot wound. What really needs to be done is to stop the bleeding. She goes on, to address the underlying cause of inflation would be outside of the Fed's purview, since it's more of a fiscal conundrum. The government would likely have to restructure the public debt and the existing mix of taxation and spending, encourage more industrial and energy production to come online, and then leave it to the Fed to harden the currency after that point. This combination might give them a decent foundation for a period of long-term disinflationary growth. So how specifically could this be achieved? As I've talked about in this video here, we as a society and civilization really need to adopt higher forms of energy production, like nuclear power via thorium molten salt reactors and other generation 4 technologies. And just so you understand on a basic level why this is so important, our current civilization runs on fossil fuels, which have an energy return on energy investment ratio of about 30 to 40, I would say. And thorium molten salt reactors and other nuclear energy technologies have an energy return on energy invested in the 75 range, or even higher into the millions with thorium molten salt reactors. On the other hand, renewable technologies, specifically solar PV and biofuels, have an energy return on energy investment of like 4 or 5, which according to a lot of research, which I share in that other video, is below the necessary minimum to simply keep society running at all. So why we've all been brainwashed into believing that renewable technologies are even a feasible solution at all makes no sense to me. But the point is that if we adopt a higher form of energy, then our economy will have more energy and more cheaply to do lots of economically productive things. For example, we could adopt desalination technologies and fix a water crisis. We could replace oil completely with e-fuels and not need to exchange our entire transportation infrastructure from liquid fuels to electric fuels. We could adopt hyper-effective but energy-intensive recycling technologies and solve a lot of the commodity constraints that we currently have. We could interconnect the world with high-speed rail. We could solve world hunger with indoor agriculture. And with all the extra energy we'd have from a high EROEI baseline energy source, we could also probably save the biosphere. Solution 2 to the high debt plus commodity-driven inflation problem would be to transition the current economy that's largely based on asset price bubbles into a more productive credit-based economy. By this, I mean we'd largely have to get rid of or restructure economically unproductive spending, like through welfare programs and military spending largely, and instead use the money that the federal government is spending to finance large-scale infrastructure projects, education, industry, agriculture, mining, like all these things that actually enhance the wealth of the society rather than feed off of it. Which brings me to point number 3. We should all be demanding better leadership. Now, before getting into this one, I want to throw out a little caveat because I understand there's a lot of tension regarding this topic lately. And that caveat is that everyone has a mix of good and bad in them. And it's very difficult to find any leader or leaders that are either all good or all bad. So I think we all need to take a more nuanced approach to how we view our political leadership. But with that being said, I think it's very, very clear at this point that we're facing very serious problems both in our country and in the world. And I think it behooves of all of us to have better leaders that have more of a long-term perspective on things rather than short-sighted sort of approaches that are only aimed at maintaining power. So basically what I'm trying to say is because we're facing some serious problems such as the structural inflation problem, which is the topic of this video, and others, we really need to, as a community of people, come up with some plans that actually make sense, which would actually solve our problems, and then elect pro-human leaders that will implement those plans on our behalf to all of our benefit. So anyway, hoping for the best, expecting the worst. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.